So we've talked about AI and we've talked about Neuralink. So I think the most logical step to take is supersonic jets.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even worth justifying the transition, because if you can't see the transition, like,
Yeah, honestly, I don't know why
you're
you're
lost
listening.
anyway.
Yeah.
All right, so I don't know why I got interested in this. Oh, I remember why. So I was reading a Twitter thread about deep tech, and this was one of the companies that came up. And supersonic commercial travel is something that amongst like geek communities is like weirdly revered, and I've never really understood why. So I kind of wanted to look into it. I still don't really understand why. Supersonic air travel is kind of cool, and it's got an interesting history. I don't understand why it's got this like weird pedestal in like geek aero communities. Probably because supersonic travel is just like the fastest way you can travel. And I guess humans have always been obsessed with moving as quickly as we can. All right, when do you think the first aircraft was built that could travel faster than the speed of sound? Also known as Mach 1.
Okay, so I think it's probably earlier than I would think. However, I kind of want to do the homie move and guess like more modern and let you be like, oh, it's actually 1815.
No, give me a legit guess. Yes.
I would say 1980s.
So it was actually at the end of World War II, just after World War II. So during World War II, there were a lot of groups that were trying, like for very obvious reasons, trying to develop very, very fast military aircraft. And there were a lot of reports of having successfully done that, but the first like verified manned controlled flight was done on October 14th, 1947. And it was done in this aircraft called the Bell X-1, which if I can...
So for context, if anyone didn't know, supersonic is faster than sound travel, which is why I thought it was a little bit later, because that's very fast.
It's incredibly fast. And what's really interesting is that as I look through the history, so this is the Bell X-1. It could do about 1,600 kilometers per hour, which is insanely fast. I can't believe that I didn't have this right on the top of my brain, which is what the speed of sound is. But the
342 meters per second.
Yeah, which translates to about 1,200 kilometers per hour. So this thing goes 1,600 kilometers per hour. There was then a slight variation of that called the X-1A a few years later. I think it was 2 years later. And that could do 2,600 kilometers per hour, which is insanely fast. That's like Mach 2.2. So it's like twice the speed of sound. You got multiple sound wave barriers getting past. And of all the ones that I looked at, the Bell X-1A is actually the fastest. So a lot of the ones we'll talk about, I'll give you the speeds on them following, but these were the fastest out of the ones that I looked at. Now, part of the reason for that is these are military aircraft. So you're talking about like, a pilot, one guy, and enough fuel and weaponry to do what they got to do and nothing else. So obviously I'm focused more on the commercial side, which is part of the reason why they're slower. So after the Bell X-1, the first commercial flight, so supersonic aircraft that was focused on actually transitioning passengers, I think it did its maiden flight in 1970s. And so this thing was called the Concorde, and this is probably the most famous image of a supersonic aircraft. You've got this bad boy. So a lot of people have probably seen this. This is certainly the image that I had in my mind when I think about supersonic air travel. And so this was developed sometime in the 70s, and that's when it first started operating. And it could do New York to London in 3.5 hours, which is epic. That's very, very fast. And it could do about 2,100 kilometers per hour. And it ended up getting retired in 2003, and was since then, no one has done supersonic commercial air travel. Why do you think it was retired? Like, why do you think we stopped?
All right. I think wild guess is trying to monitor air traffic with that many things flying that fast at the same time might be insane.
Nope.
Okay.
So it comes down to essentially the economics of it, but the economics didn't work because of a series of bad public incidences and the fact that it was constantly being subject to different kinds of banning. So basically the supersonic boom that happens, that classic sound that you hear when a vehicle passes the speed of sound, is this buildup of waves that essentially cascade over each other, and they constructively interfere, and they create this really big boom. And that boom follows the aircraft underneath it, right? So wherever it's traveling, underneath it, you're going to hear, with some delay, this massive supersonic boom. And so you basically can't travel anywhere over land because that boom is just insanely loud. And so in the 70s, all land routes were banned by the FAA, which is the US's Air Force regulator. And this was the pressure of various groups that didn't want to put up with listening to this shit, which is fair enough. And that meant it could only fly over water. And so there were very few flights that it could do at that speed where the distance was something it could actually travel, right? Because you're trying to travel very, very, very fast. You can only travel with so many people and so much fuel. And so there's a limit to how far you can go when you go that fast. And so really London to New York was kind of the only pathway that was viable. And then the ban was lifted in 1977 at the federal level following various activities in the Supreme Court. But then New York specifically banned it again, which then later got overturned. And so it's just this constant back and forth between groups trying to ban these flights from happening because they didn't like the noise that it created. And then they had several very deadly crashes. I mean, when you crash one of these things, no one's surviving that. There's no landing this thing safely when you're coming out of a speed that high. And so I think they had a couple of crashes in the late 90s. And yeah, as a result, these things were constantly getting banned. There were only a few routes that they could do. And there was a lot of public press showing people, dying on these flights, not dissimilar to what Boeing is experiencing at the moment. And so at the end of the day, Air France basically shut it down and said, we're not doing this anymore.
Wow.
And so since then, there haven't been any commercial supersonic jets.
So I just quickly Googled it, and it looks like the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A320 go at Mach 0.78. My question is, why don't we go 0.99?
Great question. I don't know. The boom wouldn't happen at exactly the speed of sound. I'm sure that there would be versions of it that happen slightly lower.
Because speed of sound changes based on the medium, right? So if there's weather conditions, I'm sure it might change as well.
Possibly. Also, just the faster you go, the jet stream changes. So I was looking at some of the aerodynamics that go on here and the testing that you have to do to make sure that your engines can work at low airflow speeds and at very high airflow speeds is really, really tough. It's not trivial. It kind of goes without saying, I guess. So the next jet that people started working on for this kind of stuff was the X-59. And this was actually jointly built with NASA. And part of the purpose of this jet was that they wanted to show that there were, in fact, designs that could be viable and overcome some of the technical problems. So let me get this picture up. And it's a totally whack-looking
oh my God
plane.
This looks crazy.
So this was developed for NASA by Lockheed. And it's not actually an attempt to get commercial. You can see that it only really fits one pilot. But what their primary purpose was trying to design one that could be quiet. And the analogy that I read, which I found really helpful, was that you can think of air almost like a liquid, right? And when essentially what this supersonic boom is this wave of air molecules colliding into each other when you're traveling really, really fast through it. Versus if you're dive bombing into the water, you get this big splash. Whereas if you can design the right shape, you can just get into it like a pro diver and make a very, very little splash. So it's all about the shape. It's all about trying to design something that can get rid of that splash. Because that was sort of the main thing that really hurt how this thing works. So there's a couple of interesting things that they've done. One is obviously it's super thin and super long, which won't really work for a commercial liner. But the particularly innovative part was this little T shape on the tail at the end. And the specifics of the shape here is that you kind of have to throw off the air molecules somewhere, right? They have to go somewhere when you hit them. And what this is trying to do is one of two things. It's trying to direct as much of the sonic boom upwards as possible so that you're not getting as much of it going downwards, which is obviously difficult to do because you need to make sure you're maintaining the right levels of pressure so you can actually stay in flight. And the second is that tail is designed so that you get this secondary wave come through off the back of the plane that destructively interferes with the sonic boom wave below the plane and cancels it out. And this allows you to fly at supersonic speeds without having a boom underneath the plane. So you get a boom above it, but you wouldn't get one below it, or you get a much, much quieter one below it.